The desert stretched endless, a broken ocean of dust and thorn. Heat bent the horizon into liquid, where rocks shimmered like the backs of sleeping beasts. A battered stagecoach dragged itself across that emptiness, its wheels shrieking against the dry earth, its horses breathing like bellows ready to give out. Inside, Clara Wynne sat hunched, fingers clutching the frayed leather seat as if it were her last tether. Her hands were blistered, the skin cracked and raw from weeks of travel. Dust clung to her face and hair until she looked carved from the same earth she was crossing. But her eyes, dark, hollow, and heavy with a grief she would not speak, remained sharp. The coach finally lurched to a halt before a sprawl of fences and sagging barns. The ranch. It wasn't the shining promise the poster in town had whispered of. It was boards nailed against wind, rope straining against cattle that bellowed like lost souls. Smoke from the cook fires drifted, sharp with fat and sweat. The driver spat in the dirt and nodded toward the yard. "End of the road, miss." Clara stepped down, boots sinking into dust that swallowed sound. She adjusted her shawl, pulled her bag tight to her chest. Her heart beat steady, as if counting time in this strange new land. Men barely looked up from their work. Cowboys leaned on rails, eyes shaded under hats, chewing tobacco that stained the earth black. To them, she was just another cook, another pair of hands to serve them beans and bread at day's end. A woman wasn't rare here, just unremarkable. But one pair of eyes did not dismiss her. Across the yard, mounted on a horse dark as storm clouds, sat a man with a scar carving down his cheek. His hat brim shadowed most of his face, but not his stare. The weight of it reached her across the distance, rooting her boots in place. He said nothing, only watched. Clara's breath snagged. Something about him felt different, anchored, like a stone in a rushing river. He wore dust on his coat and callus on his hands like any other cowhand, yet there was stillness to him, a silence too deep to be ordinary. A crow passed overhead, its shadow cutting across the dirt. The moment broke when he turned his horse away, blending back into the line of men driving cattle toward the pens. He had vanished into them like a ghost. Clara gathered herself, forcing her feet forward. A lean foreman with straw hair led her to the low building that would serve as the kitchen. The smell of old grease and smoke clung to the beams, iron pots blackened from years of flame. She set down her bag, tracing her hand along the rough table. Splinters bit into her palm. She welcomed the sting. It felt real. Outside, the rhythm of ranch life beat on. Cattle groaned, ropes snapped, boots struck wood, and the wind hissed through the gaps in the barn walls. She closed her eyes and listened, hearing not just noise but a strange kind of order, a place built on sweat and silence. Her past pressed at the edges of her mind, flashes of fire, of running through smoke with nothing but the clothes on her back. But she swallowed it down. She had come here to work, to disappear among strangers who asked no questions. As dusk fell, Clara lit the fire pit. Flames licked upward, painting her face in orange glow. She stirred beans with a wooden spoon, the smoke stinging her eyes until they watered. Cowboys filed in, bowls clattering, voices low and rough. None spoke to her beyond a muttered thanks. She preferred it that way. Yet she felt him again before she saw him. The scarred rider entered last, quiet as shadow. He took his bowl, sat apart near the edge of the fire's light. He didn't glance her way, not directly, but she felt the weight of his presence pressing against her skin like the desert sun. He ate slow, each bite deliberate, as though measuring the silence. When he finally stood, the firelight struck his scar, and for a breath he seemed carved from iron and flame. He left without a word. Clara exhaled, unaware she'd been holding her breath. She pressed a hand to her chest, steadying the tremor there. Whoever he was, he did not belong among the rest. She told herself it didn't matter. He was just another cowboy. But deep down, in the marrow of her bones, she sensed truth clawing toward her. This was no ordinary man. And though she didn't know it yet, the scarred rider was Silas Boone. Not just a cowboy, but the secret master of the very land beneath her feet. Morning on the ranch came not with songbirds, but with the raw cry of cattle. The sun rose hard and merciless, a blazing, coin nailed to the pale sky, dragging heat across the land. Dust lifted under boots and hooves, coating everything in the same dull shade. Clara rose before the men, stoking the fire pits with wood so dry it snapped like bone. She bent over the flames, her skin flushed red from the heat, smoke clinging to her hair until it smelled of ash. Her fingers, already scarred from travel, hardened against the handle of the iron skillet. She stirred beans, cracked eggs, fried bacon until grease spit fire at her wrists. The cowboys came in waves, bowls and tin cups in hand. They grumbled thanks in half-words, voices gravelly with sleep. No one lingered. Work waited, ropes to mend, cattle to push, fences to ride. Their rhythm was harsh and unchanging, as if the land itself set the pace. Through the haze of her work, Clara caught glimpses of him, the scarred rider, Silas Boone. He worked among them without claim to authority, dragging posts, hauling rope, his silence more commanding than orders would have been. Sweat marked his shirt, dust clung to his boots, and still he carried himself like stone among reeds. At night, when the cattle finally stilled and the men gathered around the fires, she saw the difference more clearly. He never sat with the rest, never joined their drunken laughter or crude tales. Always apart, his eyes fixed on the flames, as though trapped in the flicker of some memory he could not escape. The others noticed too, though they spoke of it only in whispers. "Boone's got ghosts," one muttered one evening, staring into his cup. "Ghosts that ride on horseback," another added. "Men don't forget what he's done." Clara pretended not to hear, but the words crawled into her mind like burrs. She had sensed his weight the first time she saw him, but now she began to see the shadow stretched longer than the man himself. Days slipped into one another, each painted the same: sunrise, sweat, silence. But beneath the sameness, a storm brewed. Not in the sky, which remained cloudless and cruel, but in the talk that traveled across the yard. Riders had been spotted at the far edge of Boone land. Not neighbors, not ranchers, bounty men. Their presence was a warning, like wolves circling. Sheep, the whispers grew sharper. Men spoke of killings in border towns, of debts carved into bone, of blood spilled that had bought this land in silence. Silas Boone's name rolled off their tongues, half in fear, half in awe. Clara listened, her hands never pausing in their work, but her heart thrumming harder with each word. She had run from her own past, yet here she had walked into the shadow of a man whose very existence carried blood on its back. That night, the air was restless. Coyotes sang from the hills, their cries thin as knives. The men around the fire laughed louder than usual, their voices chasing back unease. Clara worked the table nearby, stacking bowls, wiping grease from the wood. She felt him before she saw him. Silas sat at the fire's edge, as always apart. His eyes were fixed not on her, not on the men, but on the flames themselves. The light painted his scar, hollowed his features into something ancient, something carved. He looked like a man listening to voices only he could hear. Clara lingered longer than she meant to, drawn by a gravity she could neither name nor resist. She pretended to adjust. A pan, but her gaze fell to him. He didn't look up. Then, suddenly, he spoke. His voice was low, roughened like stones dragged across dry ground. "You cook like you're feeding ghosts." Her hand froze on the pan. Heat crawled up her throat, though the fire wasn't near enough to blame. For a moment she thought to ignore him, to keep the distance safe. But something in his tone, the weight of it, pulled words out of her before she could stop them. And, "You eat like you're trying to forget one." Silence followed, thick as smoke. Around them, the other men laughed at some crude jest, their voices carrying. But in the circle of firelight between the two of them, the world had gone still. His eyes lifted, meeting hers at last. Dark, unreadable, but not empty. They carried storms. Clara felt her breath falter. It was not fear, not entirely. It was the recognition of something mirrored. Her ghosts, his ghosts, different in shape, alike in weight. He said nothing more. His gaze broke, returning to the flames, but the air between them was changed. For the first time, words had passed like sparks catching on dry grass. Later, lying on her narrow cot in the kitchen's side room, Clara stared at the cracked ceiling and replayed the moment. His voice lingered in her head. His eyes burned behind her own. She curled her hands into fists against her chest, as though to keep something from breaking free. Outside, the desert wind pushed against the shutters. Coyotes cried again, their voices distant yet haunting, as if echoing from the edges of another life. Clara closed her eyes, but the firelight followed her into sleep. And with it, the shadow of Silas Boone, outlaw, cowboy, or something deeper, burned into the corners of her restless mind. The dawn broke wrong, not with the soft moan of cattle and the thud of boots, but with a sharp crack that tore through the stillness. A gunshot. Clara froze where she stood at the kitchen table, ladle in hand, the smell of coffee drifting faint and bitter. Another shot rang out, followed by a chorus of shouts. Then came the thunder of hooves, rattling the earth, like drums of war. She stumbled to the porch, apron clenched in her fists, heart beating wild against her ribs. Dust boiled on the horizon, spreading like a storm cloud. Through it, riders burst across the fence line, guns drawn, faces shadowed by wide-brim hats. Bounty men. The cattle panicked first, bawling and scattering in a frenzy. Men shouted, grabbing rifles, scrambling for cover. Chaos swallowed the yard. But through the noise, Clara saw him. Silas Boone moved with a stillness that belonged to no ordinary man. He strode across the dirt, calm as if walking through rain, his revolver drawn without a tremor. Shots cracked. Around him, dirt spitting at his boots, but he didn't flinch. His eyes were cold, fixed, precise. Then came the first fall. One of the riders, a sneer still etched on his face, pitched backward off his saddle, blood blooming across his chest. The sound of his body hitting the dirt was dull, final. Clara's breath caught. Around her, cowhands scrambled and cursed, some firing wild, others ducking low, but one voice whispered from the shadows of the porch, sharp with awe and fear. "That ain't just a cowboy. That's Boone, the one they all been hunting." The name rolled through her like a strike of lightning. Boone. The whispers she'd heard, the shadows she'd sensed, all true. Not just a hand, not just a rider. He was the master of this land, the man whose past bled across borders, whose enemies rode through dawn to claim him. Her knuckles whitened on the wood rail of the porch. She couldn't look away. Each movement of his was brutal grace, a man who had killed before and would again, without hesitation. He was no outlaw flailing in desperation. He was trained violence, measured and merciless, bodies and horses tangled in dust. A rider broke through, charging straight toward him. Silas stepped aside, calm as stone, and fired once. The horse screamed, toppling. The man went down under it, his cry crushed to silence beneath weight and dirt. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, bile rising at the metallic scent of blood cutting through the air. Her mind screamed to turn away, but her eyes clung to him. Something in her chest twisted, fear, betrayal, but also a pull she couldn't name. The dust began to clear. The remaining bounty men, seeing their brothers in blood, pulled hard on their reins. Shouts carried across the field, threats, promises, warnings. But they didn't press further. Not today. The land had teeth, and its master had bared them. One by one, the riders pulled back, leaving only silence, bodies cooling in the dirt, and men staring at the scarred figure who had stood at their center. Silas lowered his gun. His chest rose, and fell, but not with panic, with control, always control. He turned slowly, his eyes sweeping the yard until they locked with hers. Clara's knees threatened to give beneath her. For a long moment, it felt as if the world had emptied, leaving only the two of them across the stretch of blood-stained dirt. His gaze burned into her, unflinching, unashamed. And then he spoke, his voice deep, ragged, carrying across the yard like judgment. "This land bleeds with my name. You still want to stand on it?" The words struck harder than the gunfire had. She gripped the apron at her waist, trembling. Every instinct told her to run, to flee this place that reeked of death and secrets. Yet another instinct, quieter but stronger, held her feet rooted. The other cowhands turned away, unable to hold the weight of the moment. Clara stood alone in his fire, caught between terror and something darker, something magnetic. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her throat locked, her chest heaving. Silas said nothing more. He holstered his revolver, turned back toward the fallen bodies, and began dragging them to the edge of the yard, as though death was just another chore on his ranch. Clara remained, on the porch, her world split open. The man she had begun to trust, the silent figure at the firelight, was no mere cowboy. He was Boone, and his shadow stretched farther than she could have imagined, yet even as fear raked at her bones, she couldn't look away. And deep in her, beneath the tremble of shock, something stirred, something that frightened her more than the blood in the dirt. The days that followed carried no laughter, no drunken boasting by the fire. The ranch worked as always, sun up, men driving cattle, ropes biting into hands, sweat-soaking shirts, but beneath it all lay a silence heavy as lead. The bodies had been buried in shallow graves beyond the fence line. The dust covered them, quick, as if the land itself was eager to forget. But forgetting was not so easy for the living. Clara cooked, as she always did. Firewood cracked, smoke curled upward in pale ribbons, pots hissed with grease. Yet her hands trembled when Silas, Boone entered the room. She would steady them on the rim of the iron pot, holding herself firm, but the tremor lived in her bones. At night, when she finally lay down in the small cot tucked in the side room, sleep refused her. Dreams twisted into flames, houses burning, birds screaming as their wings beat against fire, feathers curling into ash. Always the fire, always the sound of things trapped with no way out. She would wake damp with sweat, hand clutched at her chest, staring into darkness. The fire of her past still lived inside her, and it seemed this land had only fed it brighter. One evening, as the men drifted to their bunks, she found herself lingering by the kitchen table long after the bowls had been cleared. Silas sat at the far end, silent, his scar catching the glow of the lantern. He didn't eat, just sat with a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, eyes fixed on nothing. Something broke in her then, not in suddenness, but like a rope worn thin by years of strain. The words slipped free before she could hold them. "My family burned," she whispered, her voice catching like dry wood snapping. He did not move, only his gaze shifted, slow and deliberate, fixing on her with the weight of stone. "Raiders," she went on, her eyes fixed on the table. "They came in the night, took everything. Fire lit the walls before I could even rise from my bed. My mother," her voice cracked, but she forced it back. "My mother's body was gone before the roof fell." The silence pressed heavier, but she kept speaking, the flood she had held back for years spilling into the room. My brother owed debts in town. They said he couldn't pay, so they made us pay. I ran until the fire was behind me, but the screams followed. I thought if I kept moving, maybe I could leave it. But I carry it still. Every time I close my eyes, I see the birds, trapped in fire, wings beating, burning alive. Her hands shook so badly she clasped them together in her lap, as though to hold herself together. She did not look at him, afraid of the judgment, the pity, the indifference she might find. But Silas said nothing. He only listened, his face unreadable, his silence steady, not cruel, not cold, simply present. Finally, when her voice had emptied and the room was nothing but the hiss of the dying fire, he spoke. "Fire takes," he said, his words low, gravel worn smooth. "But it can make iron too." The simplicity of it struck harder than any sermon. Clara lifted her eyes to him, and for the first time she did not see the outlaw, the killer, the scarred master of this land. She saw a man burned into hardness by his own flames. A man who understood that pain did not vanish, it forged. Her throat tightened. She wanted to hate him, to fear him for what he was and what the world said of him. But instead, she felt a thread pull between them, thin but unbreakable, stretched taut across the silence. She lowered her gaze, afraid of how much she wanted to follow it. The days rolled on, the desert crawling slow under the sun. Clara worked as before, but now her eyes sought him without meaning to, catching him across the yard, watching the line of his shoulders under the weight of rope, the set of his jaw in silence. And sometimes she found him watching back, his gaze, lingering not with ownership, not with demand, but with something harder to name. The forbidden thread grew tighter each day, drawn by fire and loss, held back by fear and danger. It hummed like a wire ready to sing, though neither spoke of it again. At night, Clara dreamed still of burning birds, their wings thrashing against fire. But now, in the smoke of her sleep, she sometimes saw another figure there, a man standing still in the flames, unburned, his eyes steady, his voice saying only, "Iron." She would wake trembling, but not entirely broken. For the first time, Clara felt that perhaps the fire had not only destroyed her. Perhaps, like him, it had shaped her into something unyielding. And in that quiet, dangerous thought, the coals of something else began to glow. The first drop of rain struck the dust like a bullet. Then came another, and another. By the time the sky split open, the ranch was drowning in thunder. The storm rolled over the plains, black clouds ripped apart by lightning, rain lashing sideways in sheets. Horses screamed in their stalls, cattle pressed against fence rails. The land itself seemed to convulse. But worse than the storm were the riders that came with it. Clara saw them first through the warped glass of the kitchen window. Dark shapes, circling in the downpour, lightning flashing across their rifles. Bounty hunters. Not after cattle this time. Not to spook and test the fence line. This night, they came for Boone. The first gunshot punched through the storm, cracking like splintered bone. Wood shattered along the bunkhouse wall. Men shouted, scrambling into rain, weapons in hand. Clara ducked low, the kitchen walls trembling as bullets chewed into them. Smoke from the stove mingled with the stench of wet earth and cordite. Her breath came sharp, ragged. She pressed her palms to her ears, but it didn't block the sound. Gunfire rattled the ranch like a drum of war. Through the window she saw him. Silas Boone moved through the storm like a wolf cornered by hounds. His coat was soaked, plastered to his frame, his scar gleaming under lightning. He fired into the dark with ruthless precision, each pull of the trigger a hammer of finality. Men fell into mud, their bodies mixing with rain until it was impossible to tell blood from water. He took a shot to the shoulder. Clara saw him jerk back, teeth bared against the pain. But he did not fall. He moved forward, relentless. A man forged in violence who refused to break. The storm roared, rattling every wall, but louder still was the pounding of her heart. Clara couldn't stay hidden. Her body moved before her mind. Agreed. She flung the door wide, the rain slapping her face raw, the mud sucking at her boots. "Silas," she cried, though her voice was torn to shreds by thunder. He staggered, his arm bleeding freely, crimson washing down into the muck. His revolver clattered to the ground, his hand slick with blood. And for the first time, he swayed like he might fall. Clara threw herself to him, catching his arm, dragging him against her. She tore at her apron, ripping cloth into strips, her hands trembling but determined. She pressed them hard against the wound, the heat of his blood burning through the rain. Her face was inches from his, their breaths tangled, raw and desperate. She whispered, the words torn out of her like pieces of her soul. "I don't love skin. I love what breathes under it." Silas's eyes widened, not from pain, but from the weight of her confession. His jaw clenched, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, mixing with the blood that streaked his face. For once, the silence between them was not heavy. It was alive, sparking, dangerous as the storm itself. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The fire in his eyes answered her. Around them, the storm of violence raged. Cowboys shouted, gunfire cracked, bodies fell. Clara held him tighter, binding his wound, with hands that refused to let go. Her apron became a bandage, her body a shield. She could feel his strength fading, but also his will, unyielding, untouchable, pouring into her. Then the shouting shifted. Not from outside the fence, but inside. Through the haze of rain and smoke, Clara glimpsed movement at the gate. One of the ranch hands, a boy who had eaten at her table, bowed his head when she ladled stew, was fumbling with the lock, his face pale, eyes darting, bribed, bought, betrayal. The gate creaked open under his hands. The bounty men roared, spurring their horses forward. Silas staggered upright, pushing Clara behind him with his uninjured arm. His voice cut low, guttural, as if torn from his marrow. "Get back inside." But Clara shook her head. Soaked hair, plastered to her cheeks, eyes blazing with a fire that matched his. She would not run. Not now. The storm had only just begun. Lightning split the sky as the hunters surged through the opened gate, wolves closing in on wounded prey. The mud churned red beneath hooves and boots, the ranch trembling under the weight of betrayal. Clara stood. With him in the storm, her fear burned away, her confession binding them closer than blood. What waited beyond the rain was death or salvation. But for the first time, she no longer cared which it would be, so long as she did not face it alone. The storm bled itself dry through the night. Rain thinned to mist, thunder rolled far away, and the sky at last cracked open with the gray promise of dawn. The ranch lay broken, fences splintered, corrals torn, earth churned into a mire of blood and hoofprints. Men moved like shadows in the aftermath, tending wounds, dragging bodies, covering the fallen beneath tarps. The smell of gunpowder clung to the air, thick as smoke from a pyre. Clara stood on the porch, her apron soaked and torn, hands raw from binding wounds through the night. Her body ached, but her eyes were fixed on only one thing, on the yard. Where Silas Boone stood, he was battered, blood streaking his temple, shirt plastered to him with rain and crimson. But his stance was unbroken. The last of the bounty riders, men too proud or too desperate to flee, waited in the mud before him. Their guns still hung loose in their hands, eyes burning with the hunger of wolves unwilling to abandon their prey. The ranch hands shifted uneasily, but none stepped forward. This fight belonged to Boone. This was the debt of his name, the final weight of the blood-soaked legend he carried. Clara's breath caught as the silence stretched, broken only by the drip of water from the porch roof and the distant cry of a hawk circling in the morning sky. Then the first shot rang out. The duel was no clean draw. It was chaos. Mud splashing, bullets ripping air, men roaring curses. Silas moved like an animal cornered, each shot deliberate, each step heavy with pain. He struck one down, then another, but the cost showed in every stagger, every grimace etched deeper into his scarred face. The hunters pressed harder, sensing the weakness of a wounded predator. Clara's hands clenched against the porch rail, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could taste fear like iron on her tongue, but beneath it burned something sharper, fury. Her eyes caught on the rifle lying in the mud, half buried where a ranch hand had fallen. Its barrel gleamed faintly in the dawn light. Her body moved before her doubt could stop it. She stepped down into the yard, boots sinking in muck, skirts heavy with rain. The rifle was cold in her grip, the wood slick, the weight almost too much for her arms. Her hands trembled violently, but she braced herself, breath shaking, sight fixed on the man raising his gun at Silas's unguarded side. The world narrowed to a single thread, her heartbeat, the trigger, the space between life and death. She pulled. The shot split the silence like glass shattering. The hunter jerked, stumbled, and fell face first into the mud. The yard froze. For a heartbeat, all eyes turned to her. This woman, apron torn, hair wild, smoke still drifting from the barrel in her hands. Clara's chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, but her eyes stayed locked on Silas. And in that frozen instant, the tide broke. The remaining hunters faltered, their ferocity cracked by the sudden presence of another will, hers. Silas roared, through the blood in his throat, firing into their hesitation. Mud flew, bodies fell, the last echoes of violence tearing apart the dawn. Then it was done. The silence after battle is the heaviest sound of all. Clara's rifle slipped from her, hands sinking into the mud. She turned, just as Silas swayed, his revolver tumbling from his grasp. She caught him before he hit the ground. His body was heavy in her arms, warm with blood, rain washing over his face. His breaths came shallow, but his eyes found hers. Those storm-dark eyes, fierce even in weakness. Not alone, he rasped, the words barely a whisper. Never, she answered, her voice breaking. She cradled him against her, not caring who watched, not caring what the dawn held. The man was hers, scars and all. The ranch stood battered but breathing. Blood in the dirt, fences broken, but the ground did not take them. Morning came. Gold. Light piercing the last of the storm. The desert wind carried the scent of sage, clean and sharp, as if the land itself exhaled relief. Days later, life returned in slow, stubborn rhythms. The fences were mended, cattle corralled once more. Men limped through their chores, scars fresh but spirits steadier, and in the kitchen, firelight glowed again. Clara moved with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed, hands no longer trembling as she laid bread on the table, stirred the pot, wiped the sweat from her brow. Silas sat beside her, his arm bound in fresh bandages, his body still stiff, with wounds, but alive. Alive, and watching her with eyes softer than the land had ever seen from him. He didn't need to say anything. His silence now was not distance, but presence, the weight of a man who had chosen to stay in life when death had come so close. She set a bowl in front of him, their hands brushing just once in the passing. He didn't pull away. The morning light spilled through the window, warming the wood, touching the scars on his cheek, softening them into something almost gentle. Clara looked at him, and for the first time since fire had taken her home, she felt something she thought she had lost forever. Peace, not grand, not loud, but born of dust and blood, of scars and survival. A legacy carved in silence and held in the simple act of sharing bread at a table. The desert wind shifted outside, carrying not screams nor gunfire, but the call of distant birds. Free. And inside the small ranch kitchen, a man scarred by violence, and a woman burned by loss began, at last, to build something that might endure.